Abigail Harper slammed both hands flat on the bar and looked Ethan Calloway dead in the eyes. "Sign that paper," she said, "and I will personally drag you back from whatever grave you've already dug for yourself." That was the moment this town stopped breathing, and the moment everything began to change. If this is the kind of story that reaches all the way down into your chest and won't let go, please subscribe to this channel right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach hit a rut so deep it threw Abigail Harper clean off the bench and into the wooden side panel with a crack that would have bruised a lesser woman for a month. She didn't make a sound. She just pressed her palm against the panel, steadied herself, and looked back out the window at the land rolling past flat dry, the color of old bones, and she reminded herself that she had not come this far to arrive broken. She had come this far to arrive ready. It was the summer of 1883, and Abigail was 29 years old, and she weighed nearly 300 pounds, and she had spent every single one of those 29 years being reminded of it by people who thought that the size of a woman's body was an accurate measure of the size of her worth. She had heard it from her mother, from her schoolteacher, from the men who looked past her at church dances and then married smaller women and seemed proud of themselves for it. She had heard it from her father's business partners when she sat in on meetings, and from the women in town who smiled at her face and said unkind things about her figure the moment she turned around. She had heard it so many times and from so many directions that for a while, a long while, she believed it. But belief is a strange thing. It can be given to you without your permission. And with enough time and enough will and enough quiet mornings alone with your own thoughts, it can also be taken back. Abigail Harper had taken hers back. She had a letter in your coat pocket. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. It was from a man named Ethan Calloway, a saloon owner in Red Creek, Wyoming, who had placed a notice in a Missouri newspaper looking for a wife with practical skills and a steady character. He had not asked for beauty. He had not asked for elegance. He had asked for someone willing to work hard and stand firm and build something in a place where most people were still deciding whether to stay or leave. Abigail had written back the same day she read it. Their letters went back and forth for 6 months. He told her about the saloon, the long oak bar his father had built by hand, the tin ceiling. He was slowly repairing the crowd that had once been steady and was now growing thin. He was honest about the debt. He was honest about the difficulty. He was not a man who dressed things up to seem better than they were, and she respected that more than anything. She told him about herself in turn, her baking, her stubbornness, her refusal to pretend at things she didn't feel. She told him she wasn't the kind of woman who looked like a picture in a catalog, and he wrote back and said he wasn't looking for a picture. He was looking for a partner. That word had stayed with her longer than anything else he'd written. Partner. She thought about it now as the stagecoach rolled into Red Creek, and the driver called out the stop, and she gathered her 2 bags and climbed down onto the street, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned that the world was not built for her comfort and had decided to move through it anyway. The town was smaller than she'd expected, dustier. The main street ran maybe 4 blocks before the buildings thinned out and gave way to scrubland. There was a livery stable, a dry goods store, a post office, a church with a weather vane that had been blown sideways and never corrected. And there, at the far end of the street, was the Calloway Saloon, and even from where she stood, even squinting through the afternoon glare, she could see that something was wrong with it. The sign over the door was faded. One of the porch boards had rotted through and been covered with a flat stone someone had dragged in from the road. The windows needed washing. There was a smell coming from the side alley, something sour, something left too long in the heat. Abigail stood in the street with her 2 bags and looked at the saloon, and felt something move through her that was not quite disappointment and not quite resolve. It was more complicated than either. It was the feeling of understanding all at once that a thing was worse than you'd been told, and choosing in the same instant to stay anyway. She picked up her bags and walked toward the door. Inside, the bar was nearly empty. A man in a canvas apron stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with a cloth that was doing more harm than good. Two old men sat at a corner table with a deck of cards between them, moving the cards slowly. Not really playing, just needing something for their hands to do. A dog lay under a chair near the window. That was all. The man behind the bar looked up. He was taller than she'd imagined. Lean in a way that suggested he hadn't been eating regularly. Dark hair going gray at the temples, jaw unshaven, eyes the color of winter water, pale blue and very still. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he wasn't expecting and isn't sure how to classify. "You'd be Abigail Harper," he said. "I would," she said. He set the glass down. He did not come around the bar. He did not say welcome. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't read, and then he said very quietly, "The letter said you were practical." "It did. You'd need to be." He looked around the room, and the look on his face was something she would think about for a long time afterward. Not shame exactly, but something close to it. The look of a man who had watched something fall apart in his hands and blamed himself for every piece. "I should have told you more in the letters. I should have been clearer." "You told me there was debt," she said. "I did." "And that the business was struggling." "I did." "And you asked for a partner." He was quiet. "You asked for a partner," she said again. "That's what I came to be." "So." She set her bags down on the nearest table and looked at him steadily. "Tell me everything you left out." His name was Ethan Calloway, and what he told her in the next 20 minutes made her grip the edge of that table until her knuckles ached. His father had built the saloon 30 years ago, when Red Creek was just a survey stake and a dream. The Calloway name had meant something once. The saloon had been the center of the town, the place where deals were made, where disputes were settled, where people gathered after a hard week and remembered that they weren't alone. But his father had died 2 years back, and the debt he'd left behind was tangled and ugly, and Ethan had been fighting it alone, and the fighting had worn him down to something thin and gray. The man who held the debt was named Silas Boone. Abigail had heard of men like Silas Boone. Every town had one. The man who got there first, or got there with enough money, and slowly made everything else bend around him. He'd bought up failing businesses. He'd called in loans at the worst possible times. He'd turned Red Creek into a place where people survived more than they thrived, and he seemed to prefer it that way. "He's been waiting 2 years for me to miss a payment," Ethan said. "I missed one 3 months back. Now he's got the right to move on the building in 10 weeks. If I don't pay back what I owe plus interest, I lose the saloon. My father's saloon." He said that last part quietly, like it cost him something to say out loud. "I've tried everything I could think of. There's just not enough coming in. People have stopped." He stopped himself, shook his head. "It doesn't matter why." "It matters," Abigail said. He looked at her. "Why they stopped coming," she said. "It matters." "Why did they?" He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because there's nothing for them here anymore. It's just a place to drink. And people who just want to drink can do that cheaper at Boone's place on the other end of town. He undercut my prices last year. I couldn't match him." He said it flat, without anger, which told her that the anger had come and gone, and left him with something worse, a kind of hollow acceptance. Abigail looked at the bar, looked at the tin ceiling, looked at the 2 old men with their cards and the dog under the chair, looked at the light coming through the dusty windows. "How long has it been since there was food in here?" she asked. He blinked. "What food?" she said. "Real food, not bar nuts. Food." He thought about it. "My father used to put out stew on Fridays, kept a pot going all day. People would come in for supper. But that was—" He shook his head. "That was a long time ago." "Is the kitchen still workable?" "The kitchen's fine. I just don't have anyone who—" He paused. "Why? Is there an oven?" "A small one, yes. And there's a brick oven out back that my father built when he first opened. I haven't used it in years. I'm not sure what shape it's in." Abigail nodded very slowly, "The kitchen," she said. "Show it to me now. And then show me the brick oven. And then I need to know where the nearest miller is, and whether I can buy flour and lard and salt today before the shops close." He stared at her, not unkindly, just stunned. "We haven't even," he started. "We'll talk about everything else later," Abigail said. "There's 10 weeks. That means we don't have time to talk first and act second. We act first. We talk while we're working." She looked at him, and her voice didn't soften, but something behind it did just slightly. "Ethan, I didn't come here to watch this place die. I came here to stop it. But I need to understand what I'm working with before I can tell you what I'm going to do." He looked at her for a long, still moment. And then, for the first time since she'd walked through that door, something shifted in his face. It wasn't hope, not yet. Hope takes longer to come back than that. But it was something. The first faint crack in a wall that had been building for 2 years. "The kitchen's through here," he said. And he walked around the bar and led her into the back, and she followed him with both bags still in her hands, because she had not yet put them down. Not quite, not until she knew for certain that this was the place she meant to stay. The kitchen was better than she'd feared. The stove was old but solid. The counters were wide. There were pots hanging on the wall, a good set her future father-in-law's, by the look of them well seasoned and taken care of, even if nothing else had been. She ran her hand along the counter and checked the dry store and found it sparse but workable. And then she pushed open the back door and walked out into the alley behind the saloon and found the brick oven. It was large. Larger than she'd expected, big enough to bake 8 loaves at once, maybe 10 if she stacked them right. The brickwork was old but sound. Someone had covered the opening with a board to keep animals out. She pulled the board away and looked inside and ran her fingers along the interior walls and nodded to herself. "It just needs cleaning," she said. "And a good fire to season it again. Maybe 2 days." "You know how to use a brick oven," Ethan said from the doorway. "My grandmother had one," Abigail said. "I learned to bake in it before I learned to read." He was quiet. She turned around and looked at him. "People come to a saloon for 2 reasons," she said. "For drink, and for company. You can't compete with Boone on drink. He's got more money, and he'll undercut you every time. But company is different. Company means comfort, means warmth, means something that makes people want to come back. You can't buy that. You can't undercut that." She paused. "You create it." He leaned against the door frame. His arms were crossed, not defensively, more like he was holding himself together. "With bread," he said, not mockingly, just quietly uncertain. "With bread," she said. "And with everything that bread means. Warmth, smell, the feeling of being fed. People who are lonely come somewhere warm. People who are cold leave." She looked at the oven. "We're going to make this place warm again. And once people start coming, once they remember that this is a place they belong, we'll have something Boone can't touch." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "You really believe that?" "I do. Even with 10 weeks. 10 weeks is enough," she said. "If we start tonight." Something moved across his face, then something complicated and tired and shot through just barely, with something that was almost light. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at the oven. He looked at her. "I'll go find out if Morrison's mill is still open," he said quietly. "We can get flour before dark." She nodded. He turned to go, and then he stopped in the doorway and turned back. His voice when he spoke was lower. "Abigail." "Yes." He seemed to be searching for words. He found them slowly. "I wrote in that first letter I told you it was a hard life out here, and that I wasn't looking for someone who needed things to be easy." He stopped. "I meant that. But I want you to know that I know this is more than I said it was. In the letters. And I'm sorry for that." She looked at him steadily. "You said there was debt and struggle and hard work. You said you needed a partner. You said you weren't looking for easy." She paused. "You told me the truth. It was just the size of the truth that you undersold." A beat. "I don't hold that against you. Most people undersell the size of the truth. They're afraid it'll scare people off. Doesn't it? He asked. Not the right people, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back through the kitchen and out into the saloon, and she heard the front door open and close behind him. Abigail stood alone in the alley behind the Calloway Saloon in the dry summer heat, with the brick oven in front of her and 10 weeks and everything on the line. She pressed her palm against the old brickwork. It was warm from the sun. She could feel the solidity of it under her hand, the weight of something built to last, even if it had been forgotten for a while. She had been forgotten before, too. She knew how to come back from that. She pulled her hand away and went inside to start working. The flour arrived before dark. Ethan hauled 2 50-pound sacks through the back door and set them on the counter without a word, and Abigail was already in the kitchen, with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back, running a dry cloth along the inside walls of the oven they'd dragged in from the alley to clean properly in the light. She didn't look up when he came in. She just said, "Is Morrison's wife still doing dairy, or do I need to find another source for butter?" Ethan set the second sack down. "She is. I can ask tomorrow." "Ask tonight?" Abigail said. "I want to start before sunrise." He looked at her. "It's already past 7. I know what time it is." He didn't argue. He turned around and went back out into the evening, and Abigail kept working, and that was how their partnership began, not with ceremony, not with warmth, but with motion. With the plain and urgent logic of two people who understood that what they were trying to save did not have the patience for sentiment. She was up at 4 in the morning. The saloon was dark and still. She moved through the kitchen by feel, and by the small light of a single candle measuring flour into the big ceramic bowl she'd found on the top shelf, adding salt and lard, and the warm water she'd heated on the stove, working the dough with her hands, the way her grandmother had taught her, not gently, not carefully, but with full weight and intention, pressing and folding and turning until the dough came alive under her palms. There was something she had always trusted about that feeling. The way something shapeless became something real if you were just willing to put your hands into it and keep working. She had the first 3 loaves in the oven before the sky started to lighten. By the time Ethan came downstairs unshaven, suspicious, holding his coffee cup like a shield, the smell had already reached the stairwell. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stood there, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen from him yet. Not quite surprise. Something quieter. Something that looked like a man who had forgotten that the world could smell like that. "You actually did it," he said. "I told you I would," she said without looking up from where she was shaping the next set of loaves. "I believed you," he said. "I just didn't think you meant today." "I always mean today," she said. "Yesterday doesn't help us." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Morrison woman sent butter. It's on the side table." Abigail looked over and saw the wrapped block. She nodded. "Good. Tell her I'll bring her a loaf this afternoon." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why it'll matter." He looked at her for another moment, and then he took his coffee and went to open the saloon, and she turned back to her dough, and the morning began. The smell was the first thing. It moved through the walls of the saloon and out through the gaps in the front door and into the main street of Red Creek before the shops had even opened. Abigail had counted on that. Smell is memory. Smell is the thing that gets past a person's defenses before they've had a chance to put them up. Nobody can decide not to notice bread baking. Nobody can choose to walk past it without feeling something shift in their chest. The first person through the door was a railroad worker named Cal Briggs. Big man, sun-darkened, smelling of iron and sweat. The kind of man who ate because he had to, and never thought much about what he was eating. He came through the door of the Calloway Saloon at 20 minutes past 7 in the morning, and stood in the middle of the room looking baffled, like a man who had walked into the wrong place and wasn't sure whether to leave or stay. Ethan was behind the bar. He watched Cal Briggs standing there and said nothing. Abigail came out of the kitchen carrying a basket with the first loaves wrapped in cloth. She set the basket on the bar and looked at Cal Briggs and said, "Good morning. You want a slice?" Cal Briggs looked at the basket, looked at her, looked at the basket again. "How much?" "First one's free," she said. After that, 5 cents a slice or 15 cents for a loaf. He walked to the bar slowly like a man approaching something he wasn't quite sure was real, and she pulled back the cloth and cut him a thick slice and handed it across. He ate it standing right there at the bar, and he didn't say anything while he ate, but when he finished, he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out 15 cents and set it on the bar without being asked. "I'll take a loaf," he said. "I'll have one ready at noon," she said. "I'll put your name on it." He nodded and walked out, and Abigail looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked at Abigail, and neither of them spoke, but the 15 cents sat on the bar between them, like a small flag planted in new ground. Cal Briggs told 2 men on his crew. Those 2 men told 4 others. By 9 in the morning, there were 11 people in the Callaway Saloon, which was more than Ethan had seen on a weekday in months. By 10:30, the first batch was gone, and Abigail was back in the kitchen working the second, and she could hear through the wall the sound of voices. Actual voices. Not the low mutter of 2 old men moving cards around a table, but real conversation, the kind that has edges and energy and rises and falls. Ethan came through the kitchen door with an expression she was beginning to understand, the look of a man being forced to revise something he'd already decided was lost. "They're asking if there's more," he said. "There will be at noon," she said. "Tell them to come back. Tell them cornbread today and apple biscuits tomorrow morning." He relayed the information, and people stayed. Some of them just to wait. And because they were waiting, they ordered coffee. And because they were talking, they stayed through the morning. And by the time the second batch came out, Abigail had to send Ethan to Morrison's for more flour before the end of the day. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, she had a rhythm. She was pulling the first loaves out by 5 in the morning, and the sweet rolls by 6, and she had figured out how to run the brick oven and the kitchen stove simultaneously, so that the output was nearly twice what she could manage with one alone. Her arms ached. Her back ached. She wore the same 2 dresses in rotation, and slept fewer hours than she should have, and woke up each morning with a clarity that felt almost violent in its certainty. This was working. She could feel it working. The way you can feel a tide coming in before you see it. The town was turning slowly, and without knowing it was turning, and she was the thing making it turn. But it was on Thursday evening that she met Samuel Reed. She found him in the alley behind the saloon beside the brick oven, sitting with his knees pulled up and his back against the wall. He was 12 years old and looked younger, small and hollow-cheeked, wearing clothes that had been grown out of by someone larger and hadn't been replaced. He was staring at the oven with the specific fixed attention of someone who has been smelling something extraordinary for 3 days and has finally gotten close enough to almost touch it. He didn't hear her come out. When she pushed open the back door and stepped into the alley, he startled so badly he knocked over the tin cup beside him and scrambled halfway to his feet before she held up her hand. "Easy," she said. "I'm not going to yell at you." He froze. His eyes were large and dark and careful in the way that children's eyes get when they've learned that the world doesn't make promises it intends to keep. "What's your name?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "Samuel." "Samuel what?" A pause. "Reed." She looked at him, at the hollow of his cheeks, at the way his collar sat on his neck, because there wasn't enough of him to fill it. "When did you last eat Samuel Reed?" He looked at the ground. "Today," she said. He shook his head. "Yesterday." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She went back inside without another word. She came back with a plate thick slices of bread, a piece of hard cheese she'd bought from the grocer that morning, and half an apple left over from the biscuits. She set it down in front of him and sat on the step and said nothing. He looked at the plate for a moment, checking the way hungry children check to make sure this was real and not something that would be taken away. Then he ate. Not fast the way people eat when they're ashamed of being hungry, but steady with a kind of serious attention that made her chest hurt. When the plate was empty, he said, "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't ma'am me," she said. "I'm Abigail. You live in town." He shook his head. "Where then?" He shrugged one shoulder. "Around." She understood what that meant. She had seen enough of the world to understand exactly what that meant. "Your family?" "Pa died," he said. "Mining accident. Last winter." "Your mother?" "She left before that." He said it plainly, without drama, the way children say the plainest and most terrible things. Abigail was quiet for a moment. She looked at this 12-year-old boy sitting in her alley and thought about what it cost a person to get by without anyone in the world looking out for them. And she thought about what it does to a child. Not the hunger, though. The hunger was bad enough, but the invisibility. The feeling of being somewhere that nobody has thought to make room for you. She knew that feeling. She had known it her whole life. "You know how to sweep," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Yes." "And carry, without dropping." "Yes." "You know how to bank a fire, keep it steady, without letting it go out." He thought for a second. "I can learn." "Good answer," she said. "I'll give you 2 meals a day and 10 cents a week, and you sleep in the storeroom if you want it. You work mornings, fire sweeping, hauling supplies. Afternoons are your own." She looked at him. "You interested?" Samuel Reed looked at her for a long moment with those careful dark eyes. Then he said, "You're not worried I'll steal from you?" "I'm worried about a lot of things," Abigail said. "That's not one of them." He was quiet. Then, so small she almost missed it, he nodded. She stood up and held the door open. "Come on then," she said. "Storeroom's this way." And that was how the Cowboy Saloon got its second new resident in the same week. What happened next was the thing that Abigail had understood from the beginning, but hadn't yet seen proven that one good thing done honestly and consistently pulls other good things toward it, the way a fire pulls cold air. Samuel did his work quietly and completely without being told twice, and within 4 days he had memorized which tables needed steadying and which customers liked their coffee strong, and which of the old-timers needed the stool closest to the door, because their knees were bad. He watched everything and said little, and was so entirely and genuinely useful that within a week Ethan had stopped noticing him as a charity case and started relying on him the way you rely on something solid. And the people noticed Samuel too, not in the way they'd once noticed him or not noticed him, which was really what had been happening before. They noticed him the way people notice a child who has purpose and a place. The railroad workers ruffled his hair and slipped him extra coins. The widow Hargrove, who came in every Friday morning for bread and had started staying for coffee, brought him a proper coat that had belonged to her grandson. The old rancher Tom Beaumont, who had not spoken to anyone beyond what the transaction required in at least 2 years, started teaching Samuel to play checkers at the corner table while he waited for the afternoon crowd. None of these things were large on their own. Together, they were enormous. Because people were watching. People were watching a 12-year-old boy who had been invisible for a year become visible, and it reminded them of something they'd forgotten, that this town was supposed to take care of its own. That they were supposed to be the kind of people who noticed. By the end of the second week, the Cowboy Saloon was pulling in 3 times the daily revenue it had managed in the month before Abigail arrived. Ethan watched the numbers with an expression that kept shifting between relief and something that looked almost like fear. The fear of a man who had gotten used to losing and didn't quite know how to hold a winning hand without waiting for it to be taken away. One evening he came into the kitchen while she was tallying the day's figures at the work table. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "Silas Boone came by today." Abigail didn't look up. "What did he want?" "To see what was happening, I think. He didn't say much, just stood at the bar and had a drink and looked around." A pause. "He looked at you." Now she looked up. "He looked at me," she said. "He watched you working, moving between tables, talking to people." Ethan's voice was careful. He didn't look angry. He stopped. "Calculating," Abigail said. Ethan met her eyes. "Yes." She looked back down at the figures. "Good," she said. "Good." His voice sharpened slightly. "Boone calculating is not good, Abigail. Boone calculating is how 3 businesses on this street ended up belonging to him." "I know," she said. But it means he's taking this seriously. It means he can see that something has changed. She kept writing. Men like Boone only pay attention when they're worried. And if he's worried... She finished the line and looked up again. Then we're doing something right. Ethan stared at her. There was something working its way through him. She could see it, something stubborn and old that didn't want to be moved. You're not afraid of him, he said. It was half a question. I've been afraid of men like Silas Boone my whole life, she said. Men who decide what a thing is worth and don't think you get a say in it. She held his gaze. I'm tired of being afraid of them. It hasn't gotten me anywhere useful. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked at her for a long time, and then he said almost too quietly to hear, "My father used to say something like that." She waited. He said the only way Boone wins is if we let him define the terms. He looked at the floor. I think I forgot that. After he died, I think I just... He stopped. I let Boone define the terms. Then we changed the terms, Abigail said. He looked up at her. Starting tomorrow, she said. I want to add soup to the menu. Something hot, something simple, something that fills a person up. I want people coming here at midday and staying through supper. I want families. She paused. Can you get tables? More than what we have? And chairs. I can probably borrow from the church hall, he said slowly. Pastor Mills wouldn't mind if I asked right. Ask right, she said. And ask him something else while you're there. What? She looked at him steadily. Ask him how long it's been since this town had a real community gathering, a supper, not a church function, not a business event, just people sitting down together. Ethan was very still. What are you planning? She gathered her papers and straightened them against the table. Something that Silas Boone can't buy, she said, and can't undercut. She stood up and looked at him. I'm planning to remind this town that they belong to each other, and when people remember that... She paused. They stop being easy to pick off one by one. Ethan said nothing for a moment. The kitchen settled around them, the warmth of it, the smell of flour and wood smoke that had seeped into the walls in just 2 weeks, as if it had always been there. Then he said, He's going to push back Abigail. When he sees what we're building here, he's going to push hard. I know, she said. And we still have 8 weeks, and we're still short. I know that too, she said. He looked at her. Not with defeat, something harder than defeat. The look of a man who has stopped lying to himself and doesn't yet know what the truth is going to cost him. Are you scared? He asked. She picked up the lamp from the table. Every morning, she said. And then she walked past him and up the stairs to bed. Silas Boone made his second visit on a Monday morning, and this time he didn't bother pretending it was social. Abigail was behind the bar covering for Ethan, who had gone to the church hall to speak with Pastor Mills about borrowing tables. When the door opened and Boone walked in with 2 men behind him, not hired muscle exactly, just the kind of men who stood close to powerful people so that their size could do the talking, that politeness required them to leave unsaid. Boone himself was not a large man. He was neat and precise, the kind of neat that costs money, with a silver watch chain that caught the light when he moved, and small, intelligent eyes that missed very little. He stopped at the bar and looked at Abigail the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't fully categorized yet. You'd be the Harper woman, he said. I would, she said. She did not stop wiping down the bar. And you'd be Silas Boone. What can I get you? Nothing. He set both hands flat on the bar, mirroring, without knowing it, the gesture she had made to Ethan on her very first day. I want to speak to Calloway. He's not here right now, she said. You can speak to me or you can come back. Boone looked at her hands, her broad, capable hands still moving the cloth across the wood, and then back at her face. This is a saloon, he said, not a bakery. It's both, she said pleasantly. The bread is 15 cents a loaf. The biscuits go fast, so I'd recommend coming earlier if you want those. One of the men behind him made a sound not quite a laugh, something harder. Boone silenced him with a slight shift of his shoulder. "I want to make something clear," Boone said. "The debt Calloway owes is legal and documented. The deadline is in 7 weeks. Whatever you're doing here." He glanced around the room at the fuller tables at Samuel, moving between them, with a coffee pot at the widow Hargrove sitting with 2 other women Abigail hadn't seen in the saloon before this week. "It's not going to change those numbers." "The debt is being paid," Abigail said. She said it evenly, without heat. Boone's eyes came back to her. "Is it?" "It will be. By the deadline." "That's a confident claim for someone who's been here 3 weeks." "I'm a confident woman," she said. Surprising, I know. Something shifted in his face. Not anger. Men like Boone didn't show anger. It was too legible, too useful to the other side. But something tightened. He leaned forward just slightly. "I'll give you some advice," he said. "Free of charge. This town has a certain way things work. Businesses that understand that way tend to survive. Businesses that don't." He left the rest of the sentence in the air where it could mean several things at once. "I appreciate the advice," Abigail said. She folded the cloth and set it on the shelf behind her and looked at him directly. "Here's some in return. When a man comes into a woman's place of business before 10 in the morning to tell her how things work in this town, it usually means he's already noticed that she's figured it out herself, and he doesn't like what that means for him." She paused. "So thank you for the visit. The door's behind you." The room was very quiet. Boone looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and turned and walked out. His 2 men following, and the door swung shut behind them. And for 2 full seconds, nobody in the saloon made a sound. Then Tom Beaumont at the corner table said to nobody in particular, "Well, I'll be." And the room exhaled. Samuel appeared at Abigail's elbow. His voice was low. "That was Silas Boone," he said, as if she might not have known. "I'm aware," she said. "He owns half the town." "About that, yes." Samuel looked at the door where Boone had gone. Then he looked at her. "He didn't scare you." She looked down at the boy. "He scared me plenty," she said quietly, low enough that only he could hear. "I just didn't let him see it." She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "There's a difference. Remember that." He looked at her with those careful dark eyes. And then he nodded like he was writing it down somewhere inside himself. Ethan came back an hour later with good news about the tables, and found Abigail sitting in the kitchen with a piece of paper writing in her quick, slanted hand. He read the expression on her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about Boone's visit flatly and completely, leaving nothing out. Ethan's jaw tightened as she spoke. He sat down across from her when she finished and was quiet for a moment. "He'll do more than talk," Ethan said. "He's done it before. When the Morrison family tried to expand their mill 2 years ago, Boone called in a small debt they'd forgotten they had and tied them up in county court for 4 months. By the time it was settled, they'd missed their planting season and had to scale back." "Legal channels?" Abigail said. "Always legal," Ethan said. "That's what makes him hard to fight. He never does anything you can point to. He just makes the ground shift under your feet." Abigail looked at her paper. "Then we don't let him near the ground," she said. "We get everything he could use, the debt records, the original loan documents, the payment history, and we get them to someone who can read them properly." "Is there a lawyer in Red Creek?" "There's a man named Prescott who does legal work. He's—" Ethan hesitated. "He's done work for Boone before." "Then not him," she said. "What about the county seat? Millhaven. It's a day's ride. Can you go?" He looked at her. "You want me to ride to Millhaven to have a lawyer look at my own debt documents?" "Yes," she said. "I want to know exactly what Boone can and can't do. I want to know if there are any procedural requirements he has to meet before he can move on the building. I want to know what rights you have and what's been papered over." She met his gaze. "Because men like Boone count on the people they're pressuring not knowing what they're actually entitled to. That's half of how it works." Ethan was quiet. Then, "When?" "This week," she said. Thursday if possible. Samuel and I can manage the morning." He looked at her across the table, and something passed across his face, that she was getting better at reading the look of a man who had been alone with a problem for so long, that having someone tackle the problem alongside him felt almost unpredictable. Not bad, just unfamiliar, like a muscle that hadn't been used in too long. "All right," he said. "Thursday." She nodded and went back to her paper. But she was aware of him still sitting across from her, and after a moment he said quietly, "You know he won't stop at talk." "I know," she said. "Abigail." His voice had something different in it now. "I need you to understand what we're dealing with. Boone isn't just a businessman. He's got people in this town who tell him things. He's got arrangements with suppliers 3 counties over. When he decides to squeeze something..." He stopped. "I've watched him do it. I've watched good people lose everything and not understand how it happened until it was already done." She put the pen down and looked at him. "Ethan," she said, "I grew up in a town where the men who held the money also held the opinion of what a woman was worth and what she was allowed to try. I have been underestimated and counted out and written off by people who were very certain they knew exactly what I was capable of." She paused. Every single one of them was wrong. She picked the pen back up. Silas Boone is going to be wrong too. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and then so briefly she might have imagined it, the corner of his mouth moved. He stood up. "I'll see about Thursday," he said. 3 days later, Ethan rode to Millhaven, and the same afternoon he left. Silas Boone made his first real move. It started with flour. Abigail sent Samuel to Morrison's mill at midday for the weekly order, and Samuel came back 45 minutes later with nothing and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not quite fear, but the thing adjacent to it. The thing that knows what fear is and is trying to stay one step ahead. "Mr. Morrison says he can't fill the order," Samuel said. He was working to keep his voice steady. "He says there's a shortage. He says he's real sorry." Abigail looked at him. "A shortage?" "Yes, ma'am. He said it just came up." "Did he say anything else?" Samuel hesitated, just briefly. "Then, his boy was in the back. When I was leaving, he came out to the yard and he said..." Another hesitation. "He said his pa got a visit this morning, from someone who does business with Mr. Boone. He said he was real sorry. He said it wasn't personal." Abigail stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Samuel. Go ask Mrs. Hargrove if she wants her coffee refilled." She waited until he'd gone through the door before she let herself lean against the counter and take one long breath. This was what Ethan had warned her about. Not a direct move, nothing she could point to, just a quiet word to a supplier, a gentle reminder of who held whose debt in this county, and suddenly the flower stopped. Simple, untraceable, effective. She pushed off the counter and got her coat. She walked to Morrison's mill herself. James Morrison was a decent man in a difficult position, and she could see both things plainly when he came out to meet her, hat in hand, not quite able to look her in the face. He was about 50, weathered and honest-looking, and the shame on him was real. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper," he said. "I truly am. I've got my own family to think about." "I understand that," she said. "I don't blame you for it. I want you to know that." He looked up. "But I want to ask you something," she said. "Not about the flower, something else." She looked at him steadily. "How many businesses in this town have Boone's hand somewhere in their affairs, not owning them outright? Just enough to pull on when he needs to." Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "More than you'd think. And how many of them would be relieved if that hand wasn't there anymore?" He didn't answer, but the way his eyes moved told her enough. "I'm going to find another flower source," she said. "Today, and I'm going to make sure that the Callaway Saloon's debt gets paid on time and in full, and when it does, I'm going to remember who helped and who couldn't." She paused. "And I'm going to remember that there's a difference between a man who couldn't help and a man who wouldn't." She held out her hand. "No hard feelings, Mr. Morrison." He shook it, and the shame on him deepened, which meant the point had landed. She found flour at a dry goods operation 6 miles out of town. More expensive, required a wagon would eat into the weekly margin, but it was available, and she arranged it on the spot and drove back to Red Creek with the first load herself, handling the reins with the same flat competence she brought to everything. And when she pulled around to the alley behind the saloon, Samuel was sitting on the step waiting for her. He jumped up and started unloading without being asked. "Did you know he'd do something like this?" Samuel asked, hoisting a sack. "I expected something," she said. "I didn't know what shape it would take." "What do we do now?" She lifted the second sack. "We bake," she said. "Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow." Samuel wrestled the sack through the back door and then looked back at her. "And when he does the next thing," she looked at him, this 12-year-old boy, with his careful eyes and his grave face, asking the question like he needed the answer to be real, not just comforting. She thought about what it would mean to give him a comfortable lie. And then she thought about what she'd told him on the first day about the difference between being scared and showing it. "Then we handle the next thing," she said. "You can't fight what hasn't happened yet. You can only make sure that what you're building is solid enough to take the hit when it comes." He thought about that. Then he picked up the last sack and went inside. Ethan came back from Millhaven on Friday morning with a leather folder under his arm and a look on his face that was harder to read than usual. Not bad exactly, but complicated. He found Abigail at the work table going over accounts, and he sat down and opened the folder and pushed it toward her. "The lawyer's name is Alderman," he said. "Good man. He went through every document." He pointed to a section of close-written notes. "Boone's claim is legal. There's no question about that. But," he paused, "there are procedural requirements. He has to file a formal notice with the county clerk before he can move on the building, and that notice has to be filed no fewer than 14 days before the deadline. If he files it late, the deadline resets by 30 days automatically." Abigail looked up. "Which means if we can see the notice coming, we'd have 30 extra days," Ethan said. Alderman also found something else. He pointed to another page. "The original loan documents. The interest rate Boone has been charging, there's a question about whether it conforms to the county usury regulations that were passed in 1879. Alderman says it's not certain, but it's worth challenging." Abigail looked at the documents. "Challenging means court," she said. "It means time," Ethan said. "Even if we lose the challenge, it buys us time, and in that time, we get the money," she said. He looked at her. "We're still significantly short, Abigail." "I know the number," she said. "Do you have a plan?" She was quiet for a moment. She had been turning something over in her mind for days, something that had started as a feeling and was slowly becoming a shape. She'd watched the saloon fill and refill. She'd watched people sit with people they hadn't spoken to in months. She'd watched the widow Hargrove bring Samuel a coat, and Tom Beaumont teach him checkers, and Cal Briggs ask after him by name when he came through the door. She'd watched a town remember something it had almost entirely forgotten, and she had thought, what if that was the point? What if the bread and the soup and the clean tables and the warm room had never been about the money directly? What if they'd been about reminding people that they were a community? And what if a community reminded of itself could do what one woman and one man could not do alone? "I have the beginning of one," she said. He waited. "A supper," she said. "Not a business night, not a fundraiser with a sign on the door asking for money. A real supper free open to everyone in town, families and workers and widows and children. We cook everything. We open the doors. We let people come." She looked at him. "And then I tell them the truth." Ethan was very still. "You want to tell the whole town about the debt," he said. "I want to tell the whole town what's at stake," she said. "There's a difference. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking them to decide what kind of town they want to live in." She paused. "People will pay for something they believe in. They won't pay for something that feels like someone else's problem. We need to make this their problem, not because we push it on them, but because they understand that if this place goes, something they've been coming to rely on goes with it." Ethan looked at the table. He was quiet for a long time. long enough that she thought he was going to say no, and she was already preparing her argument for why he should say yes. Then he said, "If Boone hears we're planning it and he will hear this is a small town, he'll try to undermine it before it happens." "I know," she said. "He could spread rumors, tell people the saloon's in worse trouble than it is, tell people not to come." "He could," she said. "He probably will." Ethan looked up at her. "Then why?" "Because," she said, "if the town shows up anyway, then we've already won. And if the town doesn't show up," she paused, "then we were never going to win regardless. And at least we'll know." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low between them. The saloon was quiet beyond the kitchen wall, the end of a long Friday, the last customers finally gone. Samuel, already asleep in the storeroom. The whole weight of what they were attempting sat in the space between them. "When?" he said. "2 weeks from Saturday," she said. "That gives us time to prepare and still leaves 2 weeks before the deadline. Enough room to act on whatever happens." He nodded slowly. Then he said very quietly, "And if Boone moves before the supper, if he finds a way to accelerate the timeline, then we use what Alderman found," she said. "We challenge the interest rate. We buy time." She held his gaze. "We don't stop Ethan. Whatever he does, we don't stop. That's the only thing that matters." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of looking that isn't about seeing what's there, it's about understanding something you hadn't understood before. "All right," he said. 2 days later, Boone cut off their sugar supplier, and the day after that, a rumor began moving through Red Creek that the Calloway Saloon was 2 weeks from collapse, that Ethan Calloway had borrowed money he could never repay, that the Harper woman was a fraud who'd come out west chasing a desperate man's desperation. Abigail heard the rumor from the widow Hargrove, who came in with her chin up and her jaw set and her eyes angry on Abigail's behalf, and who said, "You should know what's being said, so you can decide what to do about it." Abigail thanked her and went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment with both hands pressed flat on the wood. Then she started making the announcements for the community supper. The announcements went out on a Tuesday. Abigail wrote them herself, plain language. No flourish, no desperation in the wording, because desperation repels the exact people you need. She wrote, "The Calloway Saloon invites every family, every worker, every neighbor in Red Creek to a free community supper. Saturday evening doors open at 6. Come hungry. Bring whoever you'd like. No charge, no obligation, just food and good company." She gave copies to Samuel and sent him through town with instructions to put one in every hand that would take it and leave one on every counter where the owner would allow it. Samuel came back 2 hours later and reported that most people had taken the flyer without comment. A few had asked questions, and 2 had told him that they'd heard the saloon was finished and that it seemed a strange thing to be hosting a party when you were about to lose everything. Abigail nodded and said, "Good. That means they're curious." Samuel thought about that. "Curiosity brings people. Curiosity brings people more reliably than charity does," she said. "People want to see what happens. That's human nature. We use it." He handed her the last remaining flyer. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Ethan had spent the day making arrangements, borrowing the long tables from the church hall, as Pastor Mills had agreed, and 2 more from the Grange, and a set of mismatched chairs from 3 different households whose owners had offered them without being asked because word travels in a small town faster than any announcement. He came back in the late afternoon with dirt on his jacket and a look of tired determination. "Hargrove's bringing her canning," he said. "Beets and green beans and 2 dozen jars of apple preserves. The Morrison boy, not James, his younger one, he said he'd bring 2 dressed chickens. Anonymously, he said. His father doesn't know." Abigail looked up from the stove. "He said anonymously. He said he wanted to help, but he didn't want his father to catch trouble for it." Ethan paused. "I told him the chickens were welcome, and his name wasn't required." She nodded. She understood completely. This was how it worked. Not everyone could stand in the open, not when Boone's shadow fell across their livelihood. But people found their own way to push back when they believed in something. Anonymous chickens were still chickens. "How are we on bread?" Ethan asked. "I'll bake Thursday night through Friday," she said. "Saturday morning I'll do the sweet rolls. We'll have enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Boone's going to know about this? If he doesn't already?" "He already does," she said. "Samuel saw one of Boone's men taking a flyer off the post office door this afternoon." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What do you think he'll do?" "I think he'll tell people not to come," she said. "He might offer something that night, a free drink at his place, something to draw people away. He might spread more rumors between now and Saturday. He might—" She stopped and turned to face him directly. "It doesn't matter what he does. We can't control what he does. We can only control whether we're ready. And are we?" "We will be," she said. Wednesday arrived and brought with it the first serious problem. Abigail was measuring the remaining lard when Samuel came into the kitchen at a speed just below running, which she had learned was his version of urgent. He never ran unless something was genuinely on fire. He stopped in the doorway and said, "There's a man outside. Says he's from the county clerk's office. He's got papers for Mr. Calloway." Abigail set the lard down. "Where's Ethan?" "Out back fixing the oven grate." "Get him," she said. "Now." She went out to the front of the saloon. The man from the county clerk's office was about 30 officious in the way of small bureaucrats who have been given slightly more authority than they can comfortably hold. He had an envelope in his hand and a look of mild discomfort on his face, the look of a man who knows he's delivering something unwelcome and has been instructed not to engage with any response to it. Ethan came in from his back with grease on his hands and took the envelope and opened it, and Abigail stood beside him and read it with him. Boone had filed the formal notice with the county clerk, 14 days before the deadline, as he was required to do. This was the notice of intent to claim the property that Alderman had told them to watch for. The supper was 3 days away. If they couldn't raise what they needed on Saturday night, they would have exactly 14 days remaining before Silas Boone walked through that door with the legal right to take everything Ethan's father had built. The county clerk's man left without making eye contact. Ethan stood in the middle of the saloon with the notice in his hands, and Abigail watched something move through him. The old thing, the defeated thing, the ghost of 2 years of losing. She had watched him fight it back repeatedly in the weeks since she'd arrived. This time it surged harder than she'd seen it surge before. "He filed it early," Ethan said. His voice was flat. "He didn't have to file yet. He filed early to rattle us." "Yes," she said, "before the supper, so that everyone in town knows what it says before Saturday night." He looked up. "It'll be all over Red Creek by tomorrow morning." "It will," she said, "and people will think—" He stopped. "They'll think what Boone wants them to think," she said. "That it's already decided, that it's already over, that coming to the supper is just watching a dying thing die." She paused. "And some of them will think that, and some of those people won't come." Ethan set the notice on the bar. He put both hands flat on the wood and looked at it. "Is this still worth doing?" he said. And the way he said it quietly, not dramatically, the voice of a man asking a genuine question he couldn't answer himself, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. She came to the bar and stood across from him. "Yes," she said, "because the people who come after reading that notice, those are exactly the people we need in the room. Those are the people who decided to show up anyway. And when those people decide to do something—" She held his gaze. "They don't go halfway." He looked at her. The notice lay between them on the bar like a declaration of war. "All right," he said, "Saturday." The rumor Boone spread on Thursday was a new one, and more specific and more damaging than anything that had come before. Abigail heard it from 3 different people before noon: Cal Briggs, who looked furious and uncomfortable delivering it; the widow Hargrove, who delivered it with her jaw tight and her eyes bright with indignation; and Tom Beaumont, who told it to her so she'd know it was going around and said before he finished, "I don't believe a word of it, ma'am. I want you to know that. The rumor said that Abigail Harper had come to Red Creek not to be Ethan Calloway's partner, but to maneuver him into a situation where she could claim half his property in a common law arrangement, and that the community supper was designed to make the town feel obligated to pay a debt that she had engineered in the first place. It was a precise and specifically aimed piece of work. It targeted the one thing she had no defense against: the suspicion that her motives were not what they appeared to be. It couldn't be disproved directly without making her look desperate. It was designed to make her look calculating at exactly the moment she needed people to trust her completely. She stood in the kitchen after Tom Beaumont had delivered it and was quiet for a long moment. Then Samuel, who had heard the whole thing from the doorway, said, "What do we do?" She looked at him. He was watching her with those eyes that trusted her to have an answer, and she was aware of the weight of that trust in a way that made her stand straighter. "Nothing," she said. He blinked. "Nothing. We don't respond to it. We don't deny it. We don't explain ourselves." She went back to the bread she'd been shaping. "You know what happens when you chase a rumor? You make it bigger. You make it the conversation. You make people who hadn't heard it go looking for it." She pressed her palms into the dough. "We show up Saturday. We feed people. We tell the truth. And the truth is going to be more interesting than Boone's story, because the truth is happening right in front of their eyes." Samuel was quiet. Then, "What if they believe him?" "Some will," she said. "That's how it is. You can't reach everyone." She looked at him. "You focus on the ones you can reach. You do the thing you know is right, and you let that be enough." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded, and she saw in him something she recognized: the act of deciding to trust a principle you can't yet verify. The faith that rightness done consistently compounds. Saturday arrived, the way significant days always do, not with fanfare, but with an ordinary morning that carries an unusual weight. Abigail had been up since 3. The bread was done, the sweet rolls were done, 2 enormous pots of vegetable soup were going on the stove, and Mrs. Hargrove's canning was arranged on the side table. The anonymous chickens had arrived Friday evening, already dressed with a note that said, "Only good luck," in an unpracticed hand that Abigail thought might belong to the Morrison boy. By 5:30, Samuel had set every borrowed table in rows across the saloon floor, and was going around with a cloth making sure every surface was clean. Ethan had carried in chairs from the back and set them, and he was doing it quietly and methodically without speaking, and Abigail watched him from the kitchen door for a moment, the set of his shoulders, the controlled steadiness of his movements. And she thought that this was what a man looked like when he'd decided to stop waiting to lose and had committed himself completely to the attempt. She went back to the soup. At 5:45, nobody had arrived. At 5:45, nobody had arrived. Abigail was in the kitchen. She could hear Ethan in the front room. No voices, just his footsteps moving between tables, adjusting something, the small sound of a man filling silence with motion. She knew exactly what he was feeling. She was feeling it too. The particular specific dread of having done everything right and not knowing if it was going to matter. At 6:02, the door opened. She heard it from the kitchen, the squeak of the hinge that Ethan had been meaning to fix since her first week. She didn't go out. She waited. Then she heard a voice she recognized, Tom Beaumont, gruff and certain. "I told my brother and he told his neighbor, and near as I can tell half the county's about 10 minutes behind me, so you'd better have those tables ready." Ethan's voice quieter. "They're ready." "Good," Tom Beaumont said. "Now stop standing there looking like a man at his own funeral and pour me a coffee." Abigail pressed her hand over her mouth for one moment. Then she straightened, smoothed her apron, and went back to the soup. The door opened again at 6:03, and again at 5 past. And then it opened and didn't entirely close again, because people were coming through it steadily. Railroad workers and ranch families and merchants and widows and children, who pressed themselves against their mothers' sides and stared at the tables piled with food with enormous eyes. By 6:30, every chair was taken. By 6:45, Ethan had borrowed more chairs from the back room, and those were taken too, and people were standing along the walls. By 7 o'clock, the Calloway Saloon held more people than it had contained at any point in its 30-year history, and the noise in the room was the best noise Abigail had ever heard in her life. Voices overlapping, children laughing, the particular warmth of people pressed together, who have remembered that they know each other. She moved between tables with bread and soup, and people took what she offered and thanked her. And she said, "You're welcome," and kept moving. And she noticed things as she went. Cal Briggs sitting next to James Morrison, the two men who'd been on opposite sides of Boone's pressure, talking with the focused energy of people working something out. The widow Hargrove with two women Abigail had not met yet. 3 women of a certain age, who had the look of people discovering they had more in common than they'd realized. Samuel moving through the crowd with a coffee pot, and people greeting him by name. At 7:30, Abigail went to the front of the room. She didn't call for quiet dramatically. She just stood where most people could see her, and the room quieted itself the way rooms do when someone stands up with intention. She looked at the faces in front of her. "I want to tell you the truth," she said. "All of it." She told them about the debt, the exact number. She told them about Boone's formal notice and the 14-day deadline. She told them about the flour and the sugar and the rumors, not with anger, but plainly the way you lay facts on a table so people can see them clearly. She told them that the Calloway Saloon had belonged to this town for 30 years, and that what happened to it in the next 2 weeks was not just Ethan's problem, it was a question of what kind of town Red Creek intended to be. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. She looked at them and she said, "I'm not asking you to give anything to me or to Ethan. I'm asking you to decide what this place means to you. And if it means something, if what we've been building here these past weeks means something, then I trust you to act on that. That's all." She stepped back. The room was silent. Abigail felt the silence press against her and held herself completely still and did not let her face show what was happening inside it, which was the specific terror of having said the truest thing you know and not knowing if it will be enough. Then Tom Beaumont stood up. He was not a demonstrative man. He had lived alone on his ranch for 9 years since his wife died, and he spoke rarely and spent money rarely, and trusted people slowly and carefully. He stood up and reached into his jacket and put a folded bill on the nearest table, and said without looking at anyone in particular, 30 years ago, my father signed his first business deal at that bar. I reckon that's worth something." He sat back down. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Cal Briggs stood up. He didn't make a speech. He just put money on the table and sat back down. Then James Morrison stood up, and the shame on his face was still there. But so was something else. Something that had decided to stop being ashamed and start being useful. He put money on the table, and he didn't sit back down. He stayed standing and looked around the room and said, "I let Boone push me. I cut off their flour supply." He said it to the room clearly without excuse. "That was wrong. I'm correcting it now." Something happened in the room when he said that. Not applause, not drama, just a kind of collective exhale, a room full of people recognizing something true and shifting toward it. Then a railroad foreman Abigail didn't know by name stood up and put down money. Then the woman from the dry goods store on the end of the main street. Then 2 of the ranch families together, the patriarch of one putting his hand briefly on the shoulder of the patriarch of the other, a gesture that contained an entire history Abigail didn't know and didn't need to. She stood at the front of the room and watched it happen, and what she felt was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated and more lasting than triumph. It was the feeling of having believed in people and being proven right. She had not done this alone. She had never thought she could do it alone. She had only believed that if she gave people a reason and a place, they would find their own way to be extraordinary. She had been right. By 11 o'clock the room had emptied slowly, family by family, the way a good evening ends. Not abruptly, but with reluctance. People pausing in the doorway to finish a sentence, to shake a hand to say they'd see each other next week. When the last person left, Ethan closed the door. He stood with his back to it for a moment. Then he turned around. He had the collection in a wooden box on the bar bills and coins, everything that had come forward through the evening. He hadn't counted it yet. He was looking at it. He looked at Abigail. His voice, when it came, was not steady. "I need to count it," he said. "But I think—" He stopped, swallowed. "I think it might be close." She nodded. Samuel appeared from the back, wide-eyed and trying not to look like he'd been listening. "Should I—" "Go to bed," Abigail said gently. "We'll tell you in the morning." He hesitated, then he went. Ethan opened the box. He began to count. Abigail sat down across from him and was quiet and let him count. The saloon was almost entirely still, just the sound of the lamp, the occasional creak of the building, settling the far-off sound of a horse somewhere on the night street. Ethan counted. His hands were steady. His face was not. He finished. He looked up. "We're short," he said. Abigail looked at him. $42 short, he said. "We're $42 short. $42. Ethan said it again quietly, like saying it a second time might change the number. It didn't. The box sat on the bar between them, and the count was what it was, and Abigail looked at it and felt the specific weight of a number that was simultaneously very large and very small. Large because they didn't have it small, because they had come so impossibly close. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the box, and she looked at the lamp, and she listened to the saloon settle around them in the dark, and she let herself feel the full measure of it. The $42, the 14 days, the years of work that had gone into Ethan's father's bar, and the weeks of her own work layered on top of it all, of it balanced on a number she couldn't cover tonight. Then she said, "How much do we have in the weekly revenue account?" Ethan looked up. "Maybe 18. 19 if the Thursday count was what I think it was." "And the bread sales from this week before tonight?" he thought. 11, possibly 12. She looked at him. "That's 30, maybe 31. He stared at her. "Abigail, that's the operating money. That's flour and lard and Samuel's wages and the Morrison delivery, and I know what it is," she said. "I'm asking if it exists." He was very still. "If we use it, we can't operate next week. We can't bake. We can't pay suppliers. We'd be paid in full," she said. "And the saloon would be ours, and we could rebuild the operating account in the weeks after." She held his gaze. "I've done the projections, Ethan. At current revenue, we rebuild the operating margin in 3 weeks, 4 at the outside. That's assuming nothing goes wrong in those 3 weeks. Something always goes wrong," she said. "That's not a reason." He pushed back from the bar and stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her. She could see the tension in him, the war between the man who had spent 2 years accepting loss as inevitable, and the man who had spent the last several weeks watching something improbable come true. "It's everything we have," he said. "Yes," she said. "If something goes wrong—" "Ethan?" Her voice was quiet, but it was firm. "Look at what happened tonight. Look at what this town just did. We are not going to fail in the next 3 weeks. Not with what we've built. Not with these people behind us." He turned around. He looked at her across the room. "You're certain," he said. "I'm not certain of anything," she said. "I'm committed. There's a difference. Certainty is a luxury. Commitment is a choice." She paused. "I'm choosing it. I'm asking if you are too." He looked at her for a long time. And then he walked back to the bar and sat down and said, "Get me the operating ledger." She got it. They sat together for the next hour, going through every number. The flour cost, the supplier schedules, what could be deferred and what couldn't, what the minimum viable week looked like if they stripped it down to bone. Abigail did the arithmetic in her quick slanted hand, and Ethan checked it, and they argued about 2 line items and agreed on everything else. And by midnight, they had a plan that was tight and unforgiving and entirely possible. $30 from the operating account combined with the collection brought them to 61, possibly 62. Still short by $9 or $10. Abigail looked at the final number. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and put something on the bar. It was a small drawstring pouch worn soft with handling. Ethan looked at it and then at her. "What is that?" he said. "My traveling money," she said. "What I brought from Missouri. What I saved for 3 years doing other people's mending and baking and whatever else they needed. She pushed it toward him. Count it. He didn't touch it. Abigail. Count it, she said. He opened the pouch and counted it, and when he was done, he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not gratitude, which would have been too simple, and not surprise, which would have been too small. It was something that had no easy name. The look of a man encountering something he had not known still existed in the world. This is $11, he said. I know what it is, she said. This is everything you had. It was everything I had, she said. Now it's what we need. She looked at him steadily. We're $2 over. $2 is a margin. We take it to Boone in the morning. He looked at the money on the bar. He looked at her. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he said very quietly, why? She understood what he was asking. Not why she had the money or why she'd brought it out. Why all of it? Why she had come, why she had stayed, why she had put her hands into someone else's failing dream and refused to let go of it. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because someone needed to, she said. And I was the one who was here. She paused. And because I stopped a long time ago waiting to be invited to matter. I just decided to matter and let the world catch up. The lamp flickered between them. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do in all the weeks since she'd arrived. He reached across the bar and covered her hand with his, briefly, the way people do when words have run out and something true needs to pass between them anyway. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over and squeezed his once and let go, and they sat together in the quiet saloon for a few more minutes, and then she said, Get some sleep. We leave at 8. He nodded and took the lamp and went upstairs, and Abigail sat alone at the bar for a little while longer. The saloon was dark except for the faint gray of the window and the cooling glow of the stove through the kitchen door. She could smell bread and wood smoke and coffee and the faint sweetness of Mrs. Hargrove's apple preserves still in the air from the evening. She thought about Missouri. She thought about the morning she had gotten up before anyone else and gone to her grandmother's kitchen and put her hands in the dough and felt the world make sense in a way it didn't make sense anywhere else. She thought about every person who had looked at her and seen only the size of her body and decided they knew everything they needed to know. She thought about the long, specific loneliness of being a person whom the world has already decided to underestimate, and she thought, look where that got them. She stood up and went to bed. In the morning, Samuel was up before either of them, which was unusual. He was standing in the kitchen when Abigail came down, and he had already banked the fire and put the coffee on and swept the floor. And he was standing at the work table with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the careful, serious expression of someone who had made a decision in the night and was committed to it. I heard you talking last night, he said, about the $42. Abigail stopped. She looked at him. Samuel? I've been saving my wages, he said. He uncrossed his arms and opened his hand. In it were coins carefully kept stacked with a precision that told her he had counted them many times. It's $4.60. I know it's not all of it, but it's what I have. She looked at the coins in his small palm. She thought about a 12-year-old boy sleeping in a storeroom, saving every dime of 10 cents a week with the seriousness of someone who had learned early that money is the difference between invisible and present. Samuel, she said. Her voice came out lower than she meant it to. This is your money. I know it's my money, he said. That's why it counts. He looked at her with those careful dark eyes. You gave me somewhere to be, he said. That's worth more than $4.60. He set the coins on the work table. It's not a charity, it's a share. She stood across the table from him for a moment and felt something move through her that was too large for the morning kitchen and too complicated to name. Then she said, All right, a share. She nodded at the coins. I'll make sure the ledger reflects it. He nodded satisfied and turned to pour the coffee. Ethan came downstairs 10 minutes later and Abigail showed him the coins without explanation. He looked at them, and then at Samuel's back, and then at Abigail, and she watched him decide not to make it into a thing, which was exactly the right decision, and he just said, "460 puts us 340 over. Better margin," and poured his coffee. 340 is a good margin, Abigail agreed. They left at 8. The ride to Boone's office took 20 minutes, and Abigail and Ethan made it mostly in silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that had developed between them over weeks of working side by side and running out of things to prove to each other. She had the money in the wooden box from the bar counted and rubber-banded in 2 lots exact to the dollar. Boone's office was at the north end of the main street above the land brokerage he also ran, and the man himself was already at his desk when they came in, which told her he'd been expecting them, or was the kind of man who was always at his desk early, because control requires constant maintenance. He looked at the box in Abigail's hands, and his expression did not change, but something happened behind his eyes. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I didn't expect to see you this morning. I expect there's a lot about this week you didn't expect," Ethan said. His voice was level. There was no triumph in it, which Abigail thought was the right tone. Triumph would have given Boone something to react to. Level was harder to answer. Abigail set the box on his desk. "Full payment," she said. "Principal and interest as documented. We'd like a receipt and the return of the deed documents, please." Boone looked at the box. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has arrived in a form he didn't predict, taking a moment to reorganize his understanding. Then he looked at Abigail. "You're going to want to count it," she said pleasantly. He counted it. He took his time. She expected that it was the last leverage he had, making them stand in his office while he ran his careful fingers through money that no longer belonged to him. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and her face entirely still, and she let him take his time. When he finished, he looked up. "It's correct," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, not panicking. Men like Boone didn't panic, but recalculating, looking for the next position. She watched him do it and felt nothing that resembled fear. "You've done something interesting here," he said. His voice was measured. "I want you to know I recognize that." "I appreciate that," she said. "It won't be easy going forward," he said. "Building something sustainable in a town this size with the competition." "Mr. Boone," she said. She said it gently, which was somehow firmer than saying it hard. "We didn't come here for your assessment of our prospects. We came for a receipt and the deed documents." She held his gaze. "We'll take those now, if you please." Something crossed his face. Not anger. Something older and quieter than anger. The expression of a man who is used to being the last word on a subject encountering a woman who simply does not accept that premise. He wrote the receipt. He retrieved the deed documents from his file cabinet and he placed them on the desk, and Abigail picked them up and read them through completely before she picked up the receipt, because she was not the kind of woman who trusted without verifying, and she had not come this far to rush the last step. Everything was in order. She put the papers under her arm and said, "Thank you for your time," and walked out, and Ethan followed her and the door closed behind them. On the street, Ethan stopped walking. Abigail stopped too and looked at him. He had the expression of a man standing on ground he'd been certain was going to give way beneath him, discovering that it was holding. He looked at the deed in her hands. He looked at her. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He exhaled long and slow, the breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for 2 years. And then he did something that surprised her. He laughed, quiet, real, not triumphant, but genuine. The laugh of someone who has been in a long dark room and just found the door. She smiled at him. She couldn't help it. "Come on," she said. "Samuel's going to want to know." They walked back to the saloon, and Samuel was at the door before they'd even reached the porch, because he was 12 and had spent the whole morning unable to pretend he wasn't watching the street. He looked at Abigail's face, and then at Ethan's face, and then back at Abigail, and she held up the deed documents, and he made a sound that was not quite a shout, and not quite a word, but was entirely sufficient. The weeks that followed were the ones Abigail would remember most clearly in the years to come. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. They rebuilt the operating margin in 3 weeks as she had projected. The bread kept selling. The community suppers became a weekly Friday tradition, smaller than the great Saturday gathering, but consistent and warm, and increasingly essential to the rhythm of the town. Samuel grew 2 inches and started doing the flour delivery run on his own, and stopped looking at the world like it was about to take something away from him. James Morrison stopped by in the 3rd week after the debt was paid and brought 2 sacks of flour without charging for them and said he didn't want a receipt, and Abigail didn't push him on it. Cal Briggs organized 3 of his railroad crew to repair the porch boards and the rotten section of the side fence, and they did it on a Sunday morning and refused payment, and ate 4 loaves of bread between them, as if that settled things. The widow Hargrove started bringing her canning every Friday without being asked, and she and Abigail developed the efficient, wordless cooperation of 2 women who understand each other's competence without needing to discuss it. Silas Boone did not disappear. Men like Boone don't disappear. But the quality of his power in Red Creek changed subtly in the way that important things change, not with announcement, but with a gradual shift in how people held themselves when his name came up. He still had his holdings and his arrangements, but he had miscalculated in a way that left a mark. He had bet against a woman and a failing saloon and a town that had forgotten itself, and all 3 had proven him wrong simultaneously, and people remembered that. On a Thursday evening in October, 6 months after Abigail Harper had stepped off the stagecoach into the dust of Red Creek with 2 bags and a letter in her coat pocket, she and Ethan Calloway were married in a simple ceremony in the saloon itself, because a church seemed too formal for what they were, and because this was the place where everything had actually happened. Pastor Mills said the words. Tom Beaumont stood up for Ethan. The widow Hargrove stood up for Abigail. Samuel stood in the middle because he couldn't be on just one side of a thing he considered entirely his own. Every table was full. People stood along the walls. Somebody had brought a fiddle, and somebody else had brought a second one, and before the evening was fully underway, the furniture had been pushed back, and there was dancing, which nobody had planned for, and which turned out to be exactly right. Abigail stood in the middle of it and looked around at the faces she knew. Now the names she had learned, the stories she had been led into, and the trust that had been extended toward her slowly, and then all at once, and she felt the fullness of it settle in her chest like bread rising, warm and solid and real. Ethan found her at the edge of the room away from the dancing, and he stood beside her and looked out at the same thing she was looking at. "What are you thinking?" he said. She considered it honestly. "I'm thinking that I came here to save a saloon," she said. "And that's not what happened." He looked at her. What happened? She looked at the room, at Samuel laughing at something Tom Beaumont had said at Cal Briggs, attempting the fiddle, and producing a sound that was enthusiastic, if not strictly musical, at James Morrison, and his wife sharing a plate in the corner at the widow Hargrove, dancing with a seriousness and precision that suggested she had been an excellent dancer in her youth and had not forgotten. "People remembered each other," she said. "That's what happened. I just gave them somewhere to do it." Ethan was quiet beside her. Then he said, "You gave them more than that." She shook her head. "No," she said. "The bread was mine. The work was mine. But what happened that Saturday night, what all these people chose to do, that was theirs. I didn't give them that. They already had it." She paused. They just needed someone to stop being afraid long enough to ask for it. He looked at her for a moment, and then he offered her his hand the way a man offers a hand to a woman he intends to keep standing beside for a long time. She took it, and in the warm, loud, lovely chaos of the Calloway Saloon on a Thursday evening in October, surrounded by a town that had chosen itself back into existence, Abigail Harper understood something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, that the strongest thing she had ever done was not the baking, not the accounting, not the standing down of Silas Boone in his own office with a box of counted money. The strongest thing she had ever done was walk through that door 6 months ago and refuse to be what people expected. to take up space without apology, to insist quietly and completely on being exactly who she was, and to trust that who she was would be enough. It was. It always had been. She just had to be the one to prove it.